Welcome back to the Governance Podcast. I'm Sam DeCanio. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Governance and Society and a lecturer in the Department of Political Economy here at King's College London. Our guest today is Nuno Monteiro, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University, where he is also Director of International Security Studies. Professor Monteiro's research examines a range of issues in international relations theory. He's the author of Theory of Unipolar Politics, published by Cambridge University Press, and he co-authored Nuclear Politics, The Strategic Causes of Proliferation with Alexandre Debs, which was also published with Cambridge. Nuno, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to begin by asking you, what initially caused you to become interested in international politics?
So I guess growing up, I read a lot about war. There were a lot of books about war in the house. And then, crucially, so I grew up in Portugal, and you have to choose a major before you apply to university, right? So when you're in your 12th grade, you need to figure out what is it you want to do for the rest of your life. And this happens around Christmas time, your decision. And someone gave me Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which had just been published. So an uncle gave me a copy, and I read it, and I thought, this sounds like a good topic. And so I studied international relations in university, and then for a long time devoted myself to political theory, political philosophy afterwards, but then came back ultimately to international relations.
So you were a graduate student at University of Chicago.
That's right.
Who were the mentors that you had there, and who influenced your thinking while you were working on your PhD?
So I went to Chicago. It's not a straightforward story. I went to Chicago to work with Robert Pippin, the head of the Social Thought Committee, because I wanted to study, I had studied Richard Rorty before, and Rorty himself told me, why don't you go to Chicago and work with Bob Pippin? So I did that. And when I got there, he got one of these MacArthur Genius Awards that comes with 4 years of leave. And so I ended up not being able to study with Robert Pippin, whom I greatly admire. And so I studied political philosophy with Martin Nussbaum and Charles Larmore for the first few years, and then eventually gravitated towards international relations, I think, for two reasons. One, rekindled interest in the topic. I started a PhD in 2002, so it was a time of sort of great activity in the domain of international security right after 9/11. So lots of interest there. And also I came up to the conclusion that maybe I wasn't really interested in political theory as a producer, sort of analyzing classical texts and writing another interpretation of this or that. Maybe wasn't sort of stimulating enough. And I was fortunate to take classes with John Mearsheimer, who became a great mentor and is a dear friend today. And so over time, I realized over a couple of years of coursework that I really enjoyed studying great power politics and theory. And so the combination, I was able to apply sort of my theory skills, such as they are, to applied theory, right, to international theory rather than to political philosophy.
So Mearsheimer falls under the general category of being a realist, and you sort of identify to some degree with this label as well.
Yeah, yes and no. So Mearsheimer is a structural realist. So he's one of the most influential structural realists working today. He belongs to a school of thought called offensive realism, of which he is the foremost exponent. I would say I am myself a realist, but not necessarily a structural realist. So although my first book, which I suppose we'll talk a little bit about, Theory of Unipolar Politics, is a structural realist book, I think my intellectual taste is realist in a broader sense, of sort of in the classical realist tradition of paying attention to power, interests, a notion of skepticism about the ability to achieve goals through complicated schemes. That's more my intellectual family than exactly structural realism, which is fine, but it's just a narrower topic.
Okay. So are there any themes in the sort of the classical realist tradition that you identify with specifically? Yes. I guess I'm just sort of curious. How do you place yourself in the sort of umbrella of different realist approaches to international relations?
So I think structural realism,
what is structural realism?
Structural realism is the idea. So it's a school of thought that I would say He's born in the second half of the 20th century, largely I would say the brainchild of Kenneth Waltz, who has two very influential books. One book in 1959, I hope I'm not getting the year wrong, called Man, the State, and War. That basically says, in that first book, there's three ways of understanding what happens in international politics. By looking at people, say leaders, men, by looking at people, by looking at states, and then by looking at what happens in the international realm itself, how states interact, and sort of carves out this third intellectual sphere that he then develops in his second book in 1979, Theory of International Politics, title on which I'm riffing clearly in my first book. That argues, in the second book, he argues, look, what matters for understanding relations among states is how many great powers there are, and what's the balance of power between them. And so it's what he calls the structure of international politics, right? So think of it as he's writing during the Cold War, where the analysis of international politics is highly influenced by ideological questions, right? One side is right, the other side is wrong. We have all these ideological overtones in the discourse about international politics, and he's saying this doesn't matter that much. Right? What matters is we're in a world with two great powers that are relatively balanced in their own power, and that have no higher authority to which they can resort, right? So the ultima ratio of international politics is their capability to use violence against each other, and if you're a state, unless you can defend yourself, you're in a very dire situation, because there's no one you can resort to that could help you face a more powerful adversary. So that's structural realism, right? And then the debates inside structural realism are debates about whether having three great powers is better than having two great powers, whether states will seek a balance of power and be satisfied with having as much power as other states, Waltz's argument, or whether states will continue to accumulate power and to desire to accumulate further power, even beyond the moment at which they're as powerful as others, Mearsheimer's argument. And so there debates about how the structure of international politics affects state behavior. Right? Classical realism, or realism writ large, is a much broader intellectual tradition that is much harder to pin down in terms of what are the core tenets, but it's easier to identify and describe by what are the core factors they look at. So they pay a lot of attention to, like structural realists more specifically, they more in general pay a lot of attention to power, to interest, to the role of violence, even in producing order, right? So that order often happens because violence is in the background, and it's our capability to use that violence that leads to the production of order, in which you actually don't observe violence, but it doesn't mean violence is not playing a role, much to the contrary. And the focus on interest and the focus on, if you will, statecraft. Right? Now, there's a caricature of this. So realism is often used not by sort of scholars describing themselves, but as a pejorative to describe others. Right? And the idea is, someone is a realist. Oh, they focus just on power, and they're warmongers, right? So the negative connotation of realism is the idea in international politics is that these are folks, in domestic politics it would be, these are folks that are like Machiavelli, right? They're about accumulating more power. In international politics, these would be folks who have no morals, no principles. They just try to maximize power, try to achieve their goals regardless of the whatever means it takes. That's not, I would say, it doesn't even begin to capture the richness of the tradition of political realism, which is more about it's a tradition that aims at being a cautionary tradition on the use of power.
So your first book, Theory of Unipolar Politics, examined this concept of unipolarity. Can you give us sort of an overview of what the central argument was that this book advanced? What is this term unipolarity? What does it refer to?
Right.
And what did you specifically argue in the book?
So the term polarity in structural realism designates the number of great powers. So you can have one of three worlds. You can have a multipolar world with three or more powers. You can have a bipolar world like the Cold War with two powers. And then after the end of the Cold War, some people call the new world of the post-Cold War a unipolar world because there's one state that's far more powerful than others, right? So the United States. And I was intrigued by the fact that, so the driving force behind the book, what led me to write the book, which was my dissertation originally. So it was about 10 years. Like I started the dissertation in 2005, and the book is 2014, 8 years. What led me to write it was structural realists would argue, so Waltz, for example, would argue that a unipolar world is impossible because a balance will recur. So as soon as one state is more powerful than others, others will get together and create an alliance and balance against that more powerful state. And so as the Cold War ends, what you see is a number of scholars saying, well, this is the unipolar moment. Famous piece by Charles Krauthammer, a public intellectual, saying, this won't last long. It can't last long because others will balance, right? So the U.S. has this sort of moment in which it can try to shape the world, but it's a rather short time window, right? And then time kept passing and others didn't balance, and so you needed to explain that. And there was a problem reconciling, the scholarship had a problem reconciling the logic of structural realism that says balances will recur with this sort of empirical reality in which there's no balance. Right? And at the same time, and going back to Waltz, I'm talking a lot about Waltz, but he's a really great influence in the sense that these are very pregnant books that lead you to think for a long time about these topics. Waltz wrote his book in 1979 about structural politics, theory of international politics. In 1981, he writes a piece for IISS here in London, one of his Adelphi papers. He writes a piece titled, I believe, Why More May Be Better. The idea that more nuclear weapons will make for a safer world. And his argument there is that once two states have nuclear weapons, they can't go to war. Okay? And it's very hard to reconcile the Waltz of 1979 with the Waltz of 1981. So if I can't go to war with you because we now both have nuclear weapons, why am I going to care about our balance of power otherwise? How many tanks you have, ships, aircraft. If we can't go to war, then these sort of smaller caliber, let's call it that way, weapons, right, under the shadow of our mutual nuclear weapons, shouldn't really matter. So it's sort of one has to give, right? It's difficult to reconcile the two.
So is it that non-nuclear weapons don't matter, or is it that the threat of mutually assured destruction essentially solidifies in the minds of states what the costs actually would be?
Correct, and therefore there would be no political goal for which you would actually plausibly threaten to go to war, because you're risking the death and destruction of the whole country. And so what it does is it severs the connection between arms and statecraft, right? Whereas for millennia you had, as Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is the same as music without instruments. So you have weapons, and in the shadow of those weapons, you try to push for your political goals by threatening to use those weapons. Now you have a situation, if you read the 1981 paper by Waltz, in which you can't really go to war to push for your goals. There's no goal that would justify the destruction of the country.
And if you were about to achieve your goals against a nuclear-armed country, you would be defeated by the nuclear exchange that they would launch.
Correct. Because you can't defend yourself vis-a-vis the other side. There's no, let's say it this way, there's no meaningful notion of victory, right? If you're about to get a victory in the battlefield, they will launch their nuclear arsenal at you and your country is obliterated. So I was trying to reconcile the two and saying, maybe it's the case that powerful states that have technological and economic capability, will balance against other states up to the acquisition of a robust nuclear arsenal, and then are sort of less worried about the balance of power after that. And maybe that explains why, after the Cold War, you have a world that's unbalanced and somewhat durable, right? Because people kept calling it the unipolar moment, but look at it this way. The Cold War ended in 1989 when the Soviets decided not to use force to protect their satellites. So 89, 99, 2009, 2019, it's been 30 years. Right? The Cold War was 45 years. We didn't call it a moment. There was no Cold War moment. So the post-Cold War, whatever the unipolar moment is, will probably end up lasting as much or more than the Cold War. So it was increasingly difficult to make arguments about just wait a little more and people will balance.
So I guess the elephant in the room for this argument would be the rise of China as an economic power and as a military one.
Correct.
So China's the economic development that they've had doesn't need much of discussion. They've embarked on a naval program that's fairly aggressive. Aggressive might not be the right word to use for it,
yes,
but they're developing a carrier fleet. Essentially, they've developed. They have a third aircraft carrier that's now under operation. How would you respond to somebody that pointed to the rise of China as a counter argument to the position
right.
that you're taking?
Right. So the rise of China is much more momentous economically than militarily, and here's what I mean. So China is now an economy that's, depends how you count it, anywhere between 2/3 and 80% of the U.S. I think if they continue on the same trajectory, in 10, 20, 30 years, they'll have an economy that's larger than the U.S. The big question, I think, for international order, the most interesting question of our times, is whether that means that they will then match the U.S. militarily. Which, by the way, does not mean, so there's two options. One is, I have no doubt, option one, that China will want to become a major player in East Asia and the Western Pacific. I have little doubt that that will be the case. I'd be shocked if the Chinese continue to be happy with the US being the dominant power in their own region, which is what happens today. So the most powerful state in East Asia and the Western Pacific today is the United States. I think we will, over time, over the next couple of decades, evolve to a balance of power in that region, a balance of military power in that region. The big question is whether China will attempt to match. So that's a big question in itself, what happens in the region. But I think the broader question, the more important question, is whether China will try to match the military capability of the US globally. Right? So the United States is the only country that can, to use, back to Ken Waltz again, to use Waltz's term, that can engage in prolonged political military operations anywhere in the world unaided, although help may be welcome. Right? So if the United States wants to fight wars in the Middle East for 2 decades, as we now know,
hypothetically,
they can. Right? They don't need to ask for help. And furthermore, different from the Cold War, they don't need to ask for permission. Right? So as Tariq Aziz, foreign minister of Saddam Hussein, said after the 1991 war, if the Soviets were still around, none of this would have happened, right? So if you're trying to think of how to react to some crisis in the Middle East in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, you need to think how Moscow will react. We don't need to think. The United States does not today need to think about how China will react militarily to a crisis in the Middle East, i.e. the Chinese do not have the power projection capability to protect the state in the Middle East from American invasion.
Sure.
And the question is, will they want to change that? So I think that's a really interesting question. Will the Chinese want to be able to project power to Latin America in 30 years? What's in it for them? What does that do for them? Right? Why would they spend the considerable resources that are necessary to build, say, a world-class carrier fleet like the US's, which is above and beyond the others? Will they do that? What's the benefit of that for them, militarily and economically? And just to go back to your original question, what's the argument in the book? The argument is that China will not want to do that. China will stay a regional power in East Asia and the Western Pacific as long as the United States behaves in a delimited way. And here's what I mean. As long as the United States does the following. Economically does not try to constrain the economic growth of China. So, as long as the United States does not try to constrain the economic growth of China, as long as the United States does not try to take away the nuclear retaliatory capability of China, and as long as the United States does not try to revise the political status quo in East Asia further in the US's favor, by, say, trying to unify Korea under the South, or by revising political regimes that are friendly to the Chinese and making them less friendly to the Chinese. As long as these three conditions are in place: unconstrained Chinese growth, retaliatory nuclear capability from the Chinese not being denied by the US, and sort of a maintenance of the status quo in the region by the US, I think the Chinese would be happy becoming a regional power and not acquiring a global power projection capability, because it's not clear. So it's incumbent upon those who think the Chinese will do that to specify why. What's the benefit of that? Why is it that it would be beneficial to China to have that? What's the interest they pursue better by having an aircraft carrier that can go to Venezuela, right, and project power and the ability to hit targets with aircraft from bases all around the world?
Although I suppose the question that's immediately posed by that is, why are they investing resources in developing aircraft carriers if that's the case? So how
the aircraft carriers they have are not comparable to the aircraft carriers the U.S. Navy operates, right?
It's true of the ones they currently have.
That's true. Yeah. So look, the question you ask about the aircraft carriers can be generalized in the following way. For anything like any weapon system, you can point to the Chinese making efforts to make it better. And therefore, I can say, well, yes, they have been making it better, but is this the first of many steps to acquire an aircraft carrier that will match the U.S. Ford class that we just started in the last decade? Or is this a limited effort that will lead them to have, yes, an aircraft carrier fleet, but not able to project power beyond the region, which requires bases, etc., etc.? The question is unanswerable empirically. Right? So whether this is the first of many steps that, at the end there's world domination, or whether this is a limited effort, the question is unanswerable. I'll point to what I think is an important statistic there. One is, two things. The first one is, the Chinese economy today, as a percentage of the American economy, is larger than the Soviet economy ever was as a percentage of the American economy during the Cold War. That is, the Chinese have more money at their disposal now to balance against the US than the Soviets ever had. Yet, I would hope you'd agree, the Chinese are not balancing as hard as the Soviets did. Right? So they have more resources available, and they're choosing not to spend all of those resources in defense systems. And there's two views on this. One is, well, they're smart. They looked at what happened to the Soviets, and they're saying, well, let's get an economy that's 2 or 3 times the U.S., and then we can invest in a real world-class battle fleet of aircraft. Or the option 2 is they're not doing this because they don't think it's in their interest. Right. I think for the time being, so we can't adjudicate empirically. Right. So the book is an effort to develop a theory that would enable you to adjudicate why is it they're not doing it, to understand why is it they're not doing it, and to understand the conditions under which they would do it. And perhaps in concluding what I'm saying about the book, I would note that the rationale behind the book was, I was reading as a graduate student, I was reading all this literature that started in 91 and that had at the time already more than 20 years, in which one side of the literature would argue the United States will be number one forever. The other side of the literature would argue this is the year the United States goes down and China matches it. And both sides were able to make internally coherent arguments, and both sides were able to amass some empirical evidence to illustrate and support their arguments. And one of my ways of doing research is to look at debates that are stuck and try to unstick them. Right? So if they're stuck, and for decades both sides can continue to support their arguments, it seems to me it's probably the case that each of these arguments is right under some conditions. So the idea is to specify the conditions under which it will go this way and the conditions under which it will go the other way. That's what I try to do in the book. I think the U.S. has not attempted to contain the economic growth of China until the Trump administration. We are now in an effort to contain the economic growth of China in some ways. I think that train has left the station. So I think there was a time window to contain the economic growth of China. So in the Clinton administration, if we had decided not to allow China to join the WTO, that would have, I think, a profound effect in their ability to generate growth. By now, the China suffers more from any trade war with the U.S. than the U.S. suffers, but I don't think it suffers enough. I don't think the United States can actually stymie the growth of China in any meaningful way. Whether it will grow or not is a different question, because there's lots of problems that are not related to U.S. policy. The United States has done a considerable effort to undermine the nuclear retaliatory capabilities of other states, so we may see some trouble there. A combination of three things. The United States is always in the business of trying to improve its surveillance and detection technology to figure out where they have their nuclear weapons. Their precision targeting technology that would then enable them to destroy those targets before they are launched, those weapons before they are launched. And the third leg of the tripod is then a modest, limited ballistic missile defense that would mop up whatever weapons we can't catch on the ground. Right? The combination of those three has a short-term effect and a long-term effect. The short-term effect is I don't think we'll see any arms control deals anytime soon, because the United States' ability to detect and target weapons in other countries' territory, and then to deploy a limited ballistic missile system, defense system, that would defend vis-a-vis the others, puts the pressure on numbers. Other countries need more weapons to overwhelm U.S. systems. Long-term, it may lead China and others, but China is the most capable state there, beyond the United States, to believe that the U.S. is actually determined to overrun them. And therefore that they should indeed devote more resources to their military. We'll see.
Okay. So that was your current book. That was your initial book project. You wrote on nuclear proliferation with Alex Debs. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on? What the current book project actually is?
So for the next book, I'm trying to tackle a broad topic. In fact, I'm trying to tackle what's the relationship between perhaps the two most important concepts in the study of politics, violence and order. So most of the scholarship of the last few decades that works on violence and order looks at how order breaks down and violence emerges. So how do you get civil wars? How do you get international wars? How do you get nuclear wars? How do you get insurgencies? How do you get terrorism? I'm interested in the opposite relation. I'm interested in the reverse relation. How can you end violence and generate order? When is it that violence deployed in support of political goals can actually lead to the creation of a political order that was part of your goals that you were trying to create with violence, right? So when can you end the use of violence and have a stable order compatible with your political goals? And I'm trying to figure out, so that, as you may imagine, it's an enormous topic on which you have to read floors of the library. It involves, I'm trying to cover terrorism, insurgency, civil war, interstate war, foreign intervention, all of those. So I'm trying to make two contributions here, and this will be a while before it's done. But the first contribution is to structure these fields and to impose order on these fields that highlights their interrelated nature. Right? So these are largely self-contained literatures on these different topics: terrorism, civil war, insurgency, interstate war. This is all political violence, and you can apply the same framework to it. So part of it is an exercise in ordering the field, pun intended. The second part of it is an argument about how most of the work that's been done on this is work that, if you read Clausewitz, as we all should,
relatively minor figure,
and someone whose work sometimes today is considered obsolete. It doesn't matter for the understanding of current wars, which are very different from the Napoleonic Wars, based on which he wrote his book. I think Clausewitz still provides the only workable framework to understand the relationship between politics and violence. And I think it may need some I wouldn't even say updating, I think that's too strong, but it may need some fleshing out. As you know, the book was unfinished, and there's thousands of books on Clausewitz's book, but I think there's still more to be done there. But the most recent work, as a result of both political and forces in the discipline of political science, how this is being studied, has been work that focuses on the strategic and even more the tactical level. So Clausewitz talks about the political level of war, at which the political leaderships decide of the groups that are fighting, states or other groups, decide what their goals are. The strategic level, in which they determine what's the strategy through which they're going to reach those goals, and they deploy forces in support of that strategy, military forces or armed forces more broadly. And then finally, the tactical goal, in which those forces are used in engagements with the adversary, so where the violence happens, battles, whatever you want to call it, firefights, terrorist acts, that will produce tactical outcomes that are then aggregated to strategic outcomes and will eventually lead to victory. So the way you win a war is by defining a strategy in support of your goal, defining tactics that you're going to employ, according to which you're going to employ your forces, and then the tactical outcomes, the battles, aggregate up. There's a chain of command that gets the message of how the battles turned out and eventually is able to concede or demand at the negotiation table, depending on these outcomes of violence. Most of the literature is on the tactical level. The military talks about the tactification of strategy. That is, most of the literature is trying to figure out, how do you end an insurgency? Is it by building schools or roads or putting cell phone towers, or is it by killing just the insurgents, or is it by targeting the village in which the insurgents are hiding, etc., etc.? These are tactical questions. I'm not saying they're unimportant, but there are equally important questions, certainly at the strategic level, but also at the political level. And I'm trying to look at how the sociology of the sides that are fighting matters. And here the basic intuition that I hope to flesh out into a fully formed argument is that if you're fighting a highly hierarchical institution, say if you're fighting Germany in World War II, they're able to mobilize an awful lot of resources. So the fighting, it will be very difficult to achieve tactical victories over them because they have a lot of forces on the field, sizable forces, well equipped, etc., well trained. At the same time, once General Jodl signs the Instrument of Surrender in 1945, the organization of the German state itself provides order in Germany, right? So you can, in part, outsource the production of order to a highly hierarchical organization. You don't need to worry that Company C, Regiment 636, is going to start World War III. This is a very different situation from when you fight an insurgent group that is often not highly hierarchical, sort of all body, no head, in which you don't have a leadership that first can aggregate the tactical outcomes that happen in the battlefield and understand what's happening to decide, okay, it's time to fold, we're going to sign a capitulation here. But more importantly, you don't have a leadership on the other side that can enforce peace after defeat. You have yourself to control that population if they maintain the capacity for violence. And so the ability to generate order is conditioned to a great extent by the sociology of your adversary.
But the organizational sociology.
Correct. The organizational sociology of the adversary.
Essentially, a relationship between their capacity for violence and correspondingly their ability to actually control the population.
Correct.
And for the command and control within the insurgent organization to control the behavior of its members.
So you end up with situations, say, like as in Ireland, right? If you sign a peace deal, there's going to be a splinter group of the real IRA, the new IRA, that will come up and say, well, we don't agree with this. And so to the extent that this type of phenomenon is possible, it's going to be harder to impose order out of violence. Put differently, it's going to be harder for you to use violence to achieve your political goals and be able to end the use of violence. Mm-hmm. So that's the core of the argument. I think it will be long time in the making. I want to talk about the sort of implications of this for state-society relations, for legal theory, for the ethics of war, the ethics of killing. So it will be, it will be a long book, a long time to write the book.
In one sense, I could see how this idea may have been influenced by counterinsurgency, the U.S.'s counterinsurgency experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it also seems as though you're offering, and so in one sense, somebody might ask whether that limits the explanatory power of the argument because it's not applicable to war between states. But it sounds as though you're offering a general framework.
Yeah, correct. It is applicable
that can incorporate both small-scale insurgencies.
That's the ambition.
Yes. And war between states, because it's essentially pointing to these sort of continuums along these variables and explaining outcomes based upon the kind of organization that you're interacting with.
While at the same time making the case that all those forms of violence sort of follow the same logic, right? Mm-hmm. That you should look at them through the prism of an integrated framework for the connection of politics and violence. And when you do that, so put it this way, the contribution is hopefully that, or what I'm aiming at, is a contribution in which if you see those phenomena through the lens that I'm laying out, that I'm offering, then you see them in a different way, and therefore will ask different questions and understand phenomena in different ways. We'll put, say, tactical outcomes, or we'll be able to evaluate tactics using metrics that you didn't have before. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm. Although in one sense, it almost seems as though it's an account that would tell a more hopeful story about the possibilities for peace following wars between states.
Correct. Correct. So in fact, I make a distinction between threats that emanate from the state and threats that emanate from society. Mm-hmm. Threats that emanate from a state are more costly to defeat, but you're better able to impose order at the end.
Right.
Whereas threats that emanate from society may be easier at the tactical level to achieve the outcome in a firefight, but it doesn't aggregate. So you can't generate order out of that. It's harder.
So the tactical outcome, a favorable tactical outcome, doesn't necessarily aggregate to peaceful, strategic, and political outcomes in the same way as when you're going to war with the state.
Correct.
So I guess one element of this argument, to bring it back to Waltzian arguments, is that you're essentially suggesting that Waltz's second level of analysis, the organizational level of analysis, his second image,
the state,
the
organization.
He calls it the state, but I guess I'm speaking of it more broadly in terms of organizational characteristics. That matters in a way that perhaps a structural realist who's emphasizing the role of anarchy in conflict between states might not necessarily take into account.
Correct. So it's a theory. So the book is titled "A Theory of Political Violence," because it is a theory of political violence, of how you should see political violence, how you can see it in an integrated way. I think it is a realist theory of political violence. It's not a structural realist theory of political violence in the sense that, as you just laid out very clearly, I'm paying attention to the second level of analysis, to the organization. So how is violence organized, and how that shapes the possibilities of order? What types of order, the costs of creating order, and the very possibility of creating order. At the same time, it has a number of realist intuitions behind it, namely prudence and skepticism about the ability to achieve political goals by using violence, which is contrary to the view of the realist as the warmonger, is sort of an age-old precept of realist thinking, right? That you should be careful about these schemes to improve order by using violence, to improve the state of the world by using violence.
Although, in one sense, I guess it does sound as though you have a bit of the realist's pessimism, in the sense that you're suggesting that even if conflict among states becomes less frequent due to technological developments in terms of the military weapon systems that they have to deploy and the economic interests of these states, insurgencies that exist don't have simple tactical or strategic solutions.
Correct.
Which I suppose is sort of an accurate depiction of the world that we're currently experiencing. And
it's shifting the emphasis of the analysis from the tactical. Right? So we have an enormous effort, both by states and by scholars, trying to understand whether what's the effect of giving cell phones, what's the effect of schools and teaching them agricultural skills and all this stuff, and that's all fine, but it should all be seen in the context of a political framework, which is the big issue at stake in the conflict, right? And we're losing just because it's not clear what the political solution would be. It doesn't mean politics doesn't matter. It may just be that there is no solution, right? And because there's no political solution, we're focusing on the tactics. And we're deluding ourselves to a certain extent.
Because that's essentially the only variable that you can try to
influence. You can control it, and you can measure the outcomes.
Right. Although, couldn't somebody come back and say that, well, what you're suggesting is that the critical thing is actually that we try to influence the organizational structure of insurgencies?
Yes, but violence often has, as we know from much literature on that, violence has consequences on the organization of the adversary that are not necessarily leading to further integration, much to the contrary, right? So often, the sociology of the adversary matters, and this has two consequences. One is adversaries that are less hierarchical to begin with will be harder to allow you to generate order. A second aspect is you may, as a result of the use of your own violence, make the adversaries less hierarchical, right? For example, efforts to decapitate the leadership of groups. It can have consequences that, if you understand them through this framework, will be very different from your measure of tactical success, right? You may be able to kill the leader of whatever the group is, but long downstream, this is going to have very pernicious consequences in the possibility of creating order.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about this project as it develops, and hope to have you back here at King's College at some point.
It would be a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nuno.
Thank you.